"I don't wear vintage junk anymore." Those were Elena's exact words as she pushed the gift box across the white tablecloth. The 1940s Omega Seamaster I'd spent months tracking down glinting under the restaurant's ambient lighting. 2 years together, and she just dismissed a $5,000 authenticated timepiece like it was costume jewelry from a gas station. The irony wasn't lost on me, sitting there in Phoenix's most upscale steakhouse while she rejected the very thing that had brought us together in the first place. I'm a 28-year-old electrical engineer, methodical by nature, someone who believes in research and thoughtful gestures. Elena was a 26-year-old marketing consultant with what I thought was genuine appreciation for craftsmanship and history. During our first months together, she'd practically dragged me through every estate sale and antique shop across Arizona, running her fingers over vintage watches with this reverent expression, talking about the stories each piece must hold. I watched her examine a 1950s Bulova one Saturday afternoon in Scottsdale, explaining how the patina told a story of decades worn on someone's wrist, how the scratches were evidence of a life fully lived. She'd spend 20 minutes studying a single timepiece, pointing out details I'd never notice, explaining the significance of different movements and case materials. That's when I knew she was different from other women I'd dated, someone who valued substance over flash, meaning over price tags. We'd spend entire weekends driving through small Arizona towns, hitting every antique shop and estate sale we could find, Elena always gravitating toward the jewelry cases while I learned to appreciate the subtle beauty of aged timepieces through her eyes. For our 2-year anniversary, I wanted something that honored that shared passion, something that showed I'd been paying attention to what truly mattered to her. The Omega had taken 3 months to find through estate dealers and collectors, another month for authentication and restoration. I'd called shops across Arizona and Nevada, networked with collectors online, even traveled to an estate auction in Tucson where it slipped away to another bidder at the last second. When I finally located this particular piece through a dealer in Scottsdale, I knew it was perfect. The watchmaker who certified it walked me through its history, a 1947 piece originally owned by a Navy officer stationed in San Diego, later passed down through his family before ending up in an estate sale when the last relative moved to assisted living. The movement was pristine, the case showed honest wear that spoke to decades of daily use, and the provenance was impeccable with original documentation. It wasn't just a watch, it was exactly the kind of piece Elena used to say she dreamed of owning someday, the type of timepiece she'd photograph at estate sales and show me later with wistful comments about finding something similar for herself. I'd even had it fitted with a new leather strap that matched the original specifications while preserving the vintage case and crown, spending an extra $200 on period-correct materials because I knew Elena would notice and appreciate those details. The restaurant was her choice, a place we'd talked about trying for months but never quite justified the expense. I made reservations for our anniversary because tonight felt significant, like we were crossing some threshold into a more serious future together. I'd been carrying the watch box in my jacket for a week, waiting for the perfect moment to present something I knew would make her eyes light up the way they had in those antique shops. When our entrees arrived, I placed the small wrapped box beside her wine glass, watching her face brighten with curiosity and anticipation. She opened it carefully, her expression shifting from excitement to confusion to something that looked almost like disappointment as she lifted the watch from its silk-lined box. She examined the aged dial, the worn crown, the way the metal had developed character over decades of wear, and I waited for that spark of recognition, for her to see what I saw in this piece of horological history. Instead, she set it back in the box with the kind of delicate care you'd use for something fragile and worthless. "I need something modern," she said, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when explaining obvious things to slower people. "Like a Cartier or Rolex that shows I'm successful, shows that my boyfriend knows how to buy appropriate gifts for someone in my position." The words hit like cold water, but I kept my expression neutral, engineer trained to process information before reacting. This wasn't about the watch anymore, I realized, watching her push the box across the table like it contained something mildly offensive. This was about what kind of man she thought I was, what kind of future she thought we were building together. The Elena who'd spent hours in antique shops talking about craftsmanship and soul had apparently been replaced by someone who measured gifts by their ability to impress strangers on Instagram. I asked if she was sure, if maybe she wanted to look at it again, but she was already standing up, gathering her purse with sharp, irritated movements that drew glances from other diners. She walked out without another word, leaving me alone with the watch, the unfinished steaks, and a check that suddenly felt like the least expensive part of this evening. I sat there for a while, looking at the Omega in its box, remembering the elderly dealer who'd sold it to me, how his eyes had softened when I explained it was for someone special who appreciated vintage pieces. The watch looked smaller somehow, sitting abandoned on the white tablecloth, but its weight felt exactly the same when I finally closed the box and slipped it back into my jacket pocket. The next morning, I drove back to the estate dealer in Scottsdale with the watch box in my passenger seat, feeling oddly calm about what I was about to do. Harold Morrison ran the shop with his daughter, specializing in authenticated timepieces and jewelry with decades of provenance documentation. He looked surprised to see me back so soon, probably expecting me to be planning a wedding rather than returning what should have been a cherished anniversary gift. I explained the situation without going into personal details, simply saying the recipient wasn't interested in vintage pieces after all, and Harold's weathered face showed the kind of understanding that comes from 50 years in the business of human nature and precious objects. He examined the watch again, confirmed the authentication paperwork was still valid, and offered me $4,300 after deducting restoration and handling fees. I accepted without negotiating, knowing I was taking a loss but feeling strangely liberated as he counted out the cash and handed me a detailed receipt showing the original $5,000 purchase price, expert certification, and return transaction. That afternoon, I drove to Elena's downtown Phoenix condo, using my key for what I suspected would be the last time. Her granite kitchen counter was spotless as always, a surface she used more for displaying designer handbags than actual food preparation, and I placed the receipt right in the center where she couldn't miss it. The itemized breakdown was impossible to ignore, showing exactly what she dismissed as junk, complete with the dealer's letterhead and authentication details that proved the watch's genuine value and historical significance. I left my copy of her spare key beside the receipt and walked out, not bothering to take the coffee mug I'd left there months ago or the extra phone charger I'd bought for convenience. My phone started buzzing around 6 that evening while I was reviewing electrical schematics for a commercial project, Elena's name lighting up the screen with an urgency I hadn't seen since she'd locked herself out of her car in a Whole Foods parking lot. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her panicked message about needing to talk immediately, something about a misunderstanding that needed to be cleared up right away. When I called back an hour later, she launched into a frantic explanation about how she'd been stressed from work lately, how she hadn't properly examined the watch at the restaurant, how she'd never meant to sound so dismissive about something I'd clearly put thought into selecting. She kept circling back to the receipt, asking detailed questions about the dealer and the authentication process, trying to understand how a watch that looked so old and worn could possibly be worth more than her monthly rent. I listened patiently while she worked through her own shock at discovering she'd rejected something genuinely valuable, something that represented months of research and significant financial investment on my part. The conversation took a sharp turn when she demanded I retrieve the watch immediately, her voice taking on that commanding tone she used when coordinating marketing campaigns or managing vendors who weren't moving fast enough for her timeline. She wanted me to call Harold, explain there had been a mistake, and buy back the watch before he had a chance to sell it to another collector. I explained calmly that the transaction was final, that I'd taken her at her word when she called it junk and acted accordingly by removing unwanted items from my possession. The silence on her end stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then she exploded with accusations about me being petty and vindictive, about how I should have known she was just having a bad day and didn't mean what she'd said about the watch. I told her our relationship was over, that her reaction to a thoughtful gift had revealed something fundamental about our compatibility that couldn't be fixed with apologies or explanations. She hung up while I was mid-sentence, but I knew this conversation was just the beginning of what was going to be a much longer and more complicated ending to our 2-year relationship. The woman who'd once spent hours analyzing the craftsmanship of vintage timepieces had become someone who measured gifts solely by their ability to impress others, and that fundamental shift told me everything I needed to know about where we were heading. Elena's campaign to win me back started the very next morning with her showing up at my Tempe apartment complex at 7:30, demanding that building security call up to my unit because she'd forgotten something important and needed to retrieve it immediately. The security guard, a retired police officer named Frank who'd seen his share of domestic drama, called to ask if I wanted to authorize her access. I told him politely that we'd broken up and she had no legitimate reason to be there, so he should ask her to leave the premises. Through my window, I watched her argue with Frank for another 10 minutes before finally storming back to her BMW, but she didn't drive away. Instead, she sat in the visitor parking area for 2 hours, presumably waiting for me to come down and talk to her, not realizing I had no plans to leave my apartment that early on a Saturday morning. When she finally left, I thought that would be the end of it, but Elena had apparently decided this was a war that required strategic coordination and multiple allies. Her best friend Chloe started calling me that afternoon, launching into a prepared speech about how Elena was devastated and couldn't understand why I was being so cruel over what she kept calling a simple misunderstanding about gift preferences. Chloe had always struck me as the type of person who viewed relationships through the lens of romantic comedies, where grand gestures and persistence eventually wore down any resistance, so her involvement didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was getting a call from Elena's mother 2 days later, a woman who'd previously seemed to view me as a temporary placeholder in her daughter's life, suddenly very interested in discussing the importance of forgiveness and second chances in mature relationships. Elena's mother had never shown much warmth toward me during family gatherings, always asking pointed questions about my career trajectory and financial prospects, but now she was practically begging me to reconsider ending things with her daughter over what she termed a momentary lapse in judgment. The most unexpected call came from Derek, my old college buddy who'd stayed in touch with Elena through social media and apparently considered himself qualified to mediate our relationship crisis. Derek had always been the type of guy who thought every problem could be solved with enough beer and straight talk, so his approach was to suggest we all meet up at a sports bar to hash things out like adults. When I explained that there was nothing to hash out because Elena had made her priorities crystal clear, Derek accused me of being stubborn and throwing away something good over my wounded pride. Elena had clearly been working every angle she could think of, painting herself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations and my inability to forgive a simple mistake made during a stressful moment. The group chat Derek created included Chloe, Elena's cousin Megan, and 2 other mutual friends, all discussing strategies for what they kept calling an intervention to help me see reason and salvage a relationship they insisted was worth fighting for. I stayed in the chat long enough to see Elena's version of events, which somehow transformed her rejection of a thoughtful anniversary gift into my failure to understand her communication style and emotional needs during a difficult period at work. According to her narrative, I was the one being materialistic by focusing on the cost of the watch instead of recognizing her deeper message about wanting our relationship to move in a more contemporary direction. The manipulation was so smooth and well-crafted that I almost admired her ability to reframe reality in a way that made her the sympathetic party and me the inflexible villain who couldn't see past his own hurt feelings to understand her genuine distress. I left the group chat without responding, but the individual messages kept coming from various members of Elena's support network, each one trying a different approach to convince me that I was making a terrible mistake by letting pride destroy what everyone else could see was true love. Meanwhile, Elena had apparently decided that direct action was required to supplement her diplomatic efforts, because she started showing up at places where she knew I might be. I discovered this when my neighbor across the hall mentioned seeing a blonde woman in a BMW circling our parking garage multiple times over the past week, always seeming to leave when she realized my car wasn't there. Elena had somehow figured out my work schedule and weekend routines well enough to maximize her chances of accidentally running into me, but I'd started varying my patterns specifically to avoid these encounters. The most audacious move came when I got home from work one Thursday to find Elena sitting in the hallway outside my apartment door, claiming she'd been waiting there for 3 hours because we needed to have an adult conversation about our future. She looked genuinely surprised when I walked past her to unlock my door and told her she needed to leave immediately, apparently expecting that her display of dedication and patience would somehow make me reconsider my decision. When she followed me toward the door, I had to explicitly state that she was not invited inside and that continuing to show up at my home uninvited would force me to involve building management and potentially the police. The desperation in her eyes was real, but it was the desperation of someone who'd lost access to something she'd taken for granted, not someone who'd genuinely realized the value of what we'd had together. I changed my locks the next day and installed a video doorbell after Frank from security mentioned that Elena had been calling the front desk daily, using different stories about forgotten items and family emergencies to try to gain access to the building. The footage from my new doorbell camera revealed that she'd been testing her old key multiple times over the past week, apparently hoping I hadn't thought to change the locks yet, which showed a level of presumption that confirmed I'd made the right decision in ending things. Elena's harassment campaign expanded to my workplace when she started calling my engineering firm's main number, claiming to be my sister with various family emergencies that required them to interrupt my meetings and put her through to my direct line. Our office manager, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia who'd dealt with her share of personal drama affecting the workplace, finally had to issue a formal warning that personal calls were disrupting business operations and needed to stop immediately. When I explained the situation to Patricia, she nodded knowingly and assured me that they'd screen any future calls claiming to be from family members, having dealt with similar situations involving employees and their unstable ex-partners in the past. The most telling aspect of Elena's entire campaign was how completely it validated my decision to end the relationship, revealing a pattern of manipulation, entitlement, and inability to accept consequences that would have only gotten worse over time if we'd stayed together and moved toward marriage as she'd obviously expected. 2 weeks after I'd changed my locks and installed the security camera, I discovered Elena had escalated far beyond harassment into actual criminal behavior when my credit card company called to verify what they flagged as suspicious online activity on my account. The fraud detection system had caught a $2,800 purchase from Cartier's website, placed at 3 a.m. using my saved payment information from Elena's laptop, where I'd apparently left my details stored from previous online purchases I'd made while visiting her apartment. The customer service representative explained that the shipping address was Elena's downtown condo, which immediately confirmed who'd made the unauthorized transaction, but the brazenness of using my financial information without permission still caught me completely off guard. I'd known Elena could be manipulative and entitled, but I hadn't expected her to cross the line into outright theft, especially something so easily traceable back to her through shipping records and digital footprints. When I called Elena to confront her about the fraudulent charge, she initially tried to play innocent, claiming she had no idea what I was talking about and suggesting maybe my card had been skimmed by identity thieves. Her performance might have been convincing if not for the fact that the Cartier website required the exact billing address and security code, information that could only have come from someone with direct access to my stored payment details on her computer. When I pressed her with the specific details the credit card company had provided, including the exact time stamp and shipping address, she finally abandoned the innocent act and launched into a defensive explanation about how she was just trying to make things even between us after I'd returned the vintage watch. According to Elena's twisted logic, since I'd gotten most of my money back from the estate dealer while she'd received nothing for the emotional distress I'd caused her, she was simply balancing the scales by purchasing something of equivalent value using my credit card. She kept emphasizing that she wasn't stealing because she fully intended for us to get back together, at which point the Cartier watch would become a shared asset in our relationship anyway, so the distinction between my money and her money was really just a technicality. The conversation became even more surreal when she started describing the watch she'd ordered, a modern piece with clean lines and contemporary styling that would look much better with her professional wardrobe than the vintage Omega ever would have. She'd clearly put thought into selecting something that matched her current aesthetic preferences, completely missing the irony that she was using my stolen credit card information to buy herself the kind of gift she'd wanted me to purchase in the first place. I explained calmly that unauthorized use of someone else's credit card constituted fraud regardless of the relationship history or her intentions for our future, and that she had exactly 24 hours to return the watch and reverse the charge before I reported the theft to both the credit card company and the Phoenix Police Department. Elena's tone shifted from defensive to threatening when she realized I was serious about involving law enforcement, accusing me of being vindictive and trying to ruin her life over money that I supposedly wouldn't even miss given my engineer salary. She kept circling back to the argument that couples share financial resources all the time, conveniently ignoring the fact that we were no longer a couple and that her unauthorized use of my credit card had happened weeks after I'd clearly ended our relationship. The situation became even more complicated when Elena's mother called me later that day, not to apologize for her daughter's criminal behavior, but to argue that young couples often have misunderstandings about money and that involving credit card companies would only create unnecessary problems for everyone involved. Elena's mother had apparently convinced herself that this was just another relationship miscommunication that could be resolved through family mediation, rather than recognizing that her daughter had committed actual fraud that could result in serious legal consequences. I explained to Elena's mother that unauthorized use of credit card information was a felony under Arizona state law, not a relationship issue, and that Elena had until tomorrow evening to return the watch and reverse the charges before I filed formal reports with both financial and legal authorities. The desperation in Elena's mother's voice was palpable as she tried various emotional appeals, including claiming that a criminal record would destroy Elena's marketing career and asking if I really wanted to ruin a young woman's entire future over what she kept calling a simple mistake made during an emotional time. I remained firm in my position that Elena had made a conscious choice to commit fraud and needed to face the consequences of that decision, regardless of her emotional state or career concerns, because allowing this behavior to continue without consequences would only enable her to escalate further with future victims. Elena returned the watch the next morning through an overnight shipping service, along with a handwritten letter explaining that she'd acted impulsively out of love and desperation, not criminal intent, and begging me not to report the incident to authorities since she'd voluntarily corrected her mistake. I verified with Cartier that the return had been processed and the charge reversed before calling the credit card company to confirm that no further action was needed since the fraudulent transaction had been resolved, but I made sure to document everything in case Elena decided to try something similar in the future. 3 weeks passed in blissful silence before Elena's most desperate and expensive attempt to prove she'd changed her perspective on vintage timepieces and our relationship. I was reviewing electrical system blueprints for a new shopping complex when a delivery truck pulled up to my apartment building, carrying a package addressed to me from a specialty watch dealer in San Diego with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside the carefully padded box was the exact same 1940s Omega Seamaster I'd returned to Harold Morrison weeks earlier, complete with authentication papers and a handwritten note from Elena explaining how she'd tracked down the California collector who'd purchased it and convinced him to sell it back to her. The letter was 3 pages of Elena's best marketing prose, describing her journey of self-discovery and newfound appreciation for vintage craftsmanship, how she'd spent hours researching the watch's history and significance, and how she now understood that my gift represented thoughtfulness and genuine care rather than outdated taste. According to her detailed explanation, she'd contacted Harold Morrison to get information about who'd bought the watch, then spent days negotiating with the collector through email and phone calls to purchase it back at a premium price. She'd borrowed $7,500 from her parents under the pretense of needing emergency dental work, then had the watch shipped directly to me as proof of her commitment to making things right between us. Elena had clearly invested significant time and money into this grand gesture, expecting it to demonstrate her growth as a person and her willingness to fight for our relationship by embracing the values I tried to share with her. When I called Elena that evening to acknowledge receiving the package, she launched into an enthusiastic explanation of her transformation, describing how she'd visited antique shops around Phoenix to educate herself about vintage timepieces and even attended an estate auction in Scottsdale to better understand the world I'd been trying to introduce her to. She'd apparently compiled research on the Omega's specific model history, learned about Seamaster production dates and movement variations, and could now speak knowledgeably about patina development and case wear patterns in ways that would have impressed me months earlier. Elena kept emphasizing how much the watch meant to her now that she understood its true value and historical significance, how she'd realized her mistake in judging it by appearance rather than appreciating its craftsmanship and provenance. The desperation in her voice was palpable as she described the lengths she'd gone to retrieve the watch, clearly expecting gratitude and immediate reconciliation based on her expensive demonstration of changed priorities. Instead of the reaction she'd obviously scripted in her mind, I calmly explained that I'd be returning the watch to Harold Morrison the next morning because her gesture proved she still fundamentally misunderstood the real issues between us. Elena's excitement turned to confusion and then panic as I explained that the problem was never about the specific watch or her appreciation for vintage timepieces, but about respect, values, and how she treated thoughtful gifts from someone who cared about her. Her willingness to spend $7,500 to buy back a watch she'd originally dismissed as junk only demonstrated that she still measured love through monetary transactions rather than genuine appreciation for the thought and effort behind gestures. I pointed out that she'd borrowed money under false pretenses to fund this supposed gesture of love, which showed she hadn't learned anything about honesty or personal responsibility from our previous interactions. Elena's voice cracked as she begged me to keep the watch and give her another chance, arguing that spending her parents' money proved how serious she was about changing and how much our relationship meant to her. I explained that real change would involve accepting responsibility for her actions, developing genuine appreciation for thoughtful gestures regardless of their price tag, and learning to value people for who they are rather than what they can provide financially. The conversation ended with Elena crying and accusing me of being impossible to please, claiming that no matter what she did or how much money she spent, I would never forgive her for one moment of poor judgment during a stressful evening. I told her she was right that I wouldn't be returning to our relationship, but wrong about the reasons, because this wasn't about forgiveness or her spending money on grand gestures. This was about fundamental incompatibility that couldn't be fixed with expensive purchases or elaborate demonstrations of changed behavior. After hanging up, I immediately called Elena's parents to inform them about their daughter's deceptive use of their money and our permanently ended relationship, feeling they deserved to know the truth about what their $7,500 had actually funded. Elena's father was surprisingly calm about the financial deception, thanking me for the information and mentioning that they'd suspected Elena wasn't being entirely truthful about her emergency dental needs given her recent emotional state and erratic behavior. The final phase of Elena's campaign came through her best friend Chloe, who requested to meet me for coffee at a neutral location to discuss what she described as Elena's complete emotional and financial breakdown following my rejection of her expensive gesture. Chloe chose a busy Starbucks in Central Phoenix, probably thinking the public setting would prevent me from being too harsh about her friend's situation, and spent the first 10 minutes describing Elena's current state as if she were discussing a natural disaster that had befallen an innocent victim. According to Chloe's account, Elena had maxed out 3 credit cards, borrowed money from family members under different pretenses, and was now facing her parents' fury over the discovered deception about the watch purchase. Elena had apparently been calling in sick to work regularly, had lost 15 pounds from stress, and was spending her evenings researching vintage timepieces obsessively while texting me messages she never sent. Chloe painted a picture of someone who'd realized too late that she'd thrown away the love of her life and was now drowning in regret and self-destructive behavior that worried everyone who cared about her. The manipulation was expertly crafted, designed to make me feel responsible for Elena's downward spiral and guilty for not accepting her increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation. Chloe kept emphasizing Elena's genuine feelings and authentic remorse, arguing that someone who'd go to such extreme lengths to fix things obviously loved me deeply and deserved another chance to prove she'd learned from her mistakes. I listened patiently to Chloe's entire presentation before explaining that Elena's current emotional state and financial problems were direct consequences of her own choices and behavior patterns that had been evident throughout our relationship. Elena's inability to accept the end of our relationship gracefully had led her to escalate from harassment to fraud to financial deception, proving that she still didn't understand basic concepts like boundaries, respect, or personal responsibility. I pointed out that real love doesn't involve judging thoughtful gifts by their price tags, committing credit card fraud, or lying to family members to fund grand gestures designed to manipulate someone back into a relationship. Chloe tried several different emotional appeals, including suggesting that Elena's behavior was just evidence of how much she cared and that most women would be thrilled to have someone fight so hard for their love. I explained that fighting for love doesn't mean refusing to accept clearly stated boundaries or escalating manipulation tactics when someone says no to reconciliation efforts. Elena's pattern of behavior showed someone who viewed relationships as transactions where sufficient effort and money could purchase the outcome she wanted, rather than understanding that genuine connections required mutual respect and compatibility. When Chloe realized her appeals weren't working, she shifted to a more threatening approach, suggesting that Elena might do something drastic if I continued to reject her attempts at making amends, essentially trying to make me responsible for Elena's mental health and potential self-harm. I told Chloe firmly that if Elena was considering harming herself, they needed to contact mental health professionals immediately, because I wasn't responsible for managing another adult's emotional reactions to consequences of their own actions. The coffee meeting ended with Chloe accusing me of being heartless, unable to recognize true love, and warning that I'd regret losing someone who'd been willing to do anything to prove her devotion. 2 days later, Elena made her final direct attempt by waiting outside my workplace during lunch hour, positioning herself by my car in the parking garage where she knew I'd have to confront her eventually. When I approached my vehicle and found her standing there with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling voice, she launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about how she'd learned to appreciate vintage things and understood now that I'd been trying to share something meaningful with her through that anniversary gift. Elena kept emphasizing her transformation and newfound maturity, but her presence in the parking garage after everything that had happened proved she still didn't understand the concept of accepting rejection and respecting boundaries. I told her clearly that our relationship was permanently over, that I needed her to stop contacting me and my workplace, and that any further attempts to approach me would result in formal complaints to building security and potentially law enforcement. When Elena started following me toward the building entrance, continuing her pleas, I called security to request an escort and assistance removing someone who was harassing me in the company parking garage. Elena's final text message arrived 3 days later, a carefully crafted piece that managed to be both an acceptance of our breakup and a last-ditch effort to make me feel guilty about my decision to end things permanently between us. The message started with what seemed like mature acknowledgement that our relationship was over and that she needed to respect my boundaries, but quickly devolved into accusations about me giving up on something special and predictions that I'd eventually regret losing someone who'd fought so hard for our love. According to Elena's final narrative, she'd done everything possible to prove her growth and commitment, from tracking down the vintage watch to educating herself about timepieces to spending thousands of dollars demonstrating her changed perspective on meaningful gifts. She positioned herself as someone who'd been willing to do anything to save our relationship while painting me as inflexible and unforgiving, unable to recognize genuine remorse or appreciate the extraordinary lengths she'd gone to make amends for one moment of poor judgment. The text concluded with Elena claiming she was finally letting go and moving on with her life, but wishing me well and hoping I'd find someone who could meet my apparently impossible standards for forgiveness and reconciliation in relationships. I read the message twice, noting how skillfully she'd managed to take responsibility for ending things while simultaneously making me the villain for not accepting her various attempts at manipulation disguised as romantic gestures. My response was brief and final, explaining that fighting for love doesn't involve disrespecting thoughtful gifts, committing fraud, lying to family members, or refusing to accept clearly stated boundaries when someone says a relationship is over. I told Elena that real love requires mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine compatibility that can't be purchased or negotiated through grand gestures funded by deception and desperation. After sending that reply, I blocked Elena's number and all her social media accounts, then contacted building security at both my apartment complex and workplace to ensure they had photos and instructions regarding someone who was no longer welcome on either property. The relief I felt after cutting off all possible avenues of contact was immediate and profound, like finally being able to breathe freely after months of walking on eggshells wondering what Elena's next escalation attempt might involve. Harold Morrison called me the following week to inform me that the Omega Seamaster had sold again, this time to a collector in Colorado who specifically appreciated its interesting journey between multiple owners and the story of how it had traveled from Arizona to California and back again before finding its final home. Harold mentioned that the collector had paid full market value and seemed genuinely excited about adding a piece with such documented provenance to his collection, which made me smile thinking about the watch finally reaching someone who would treasure it properly. I used the $4,000 from that final sale toward a solo vacation to Colorado, spending a week hiking in the Rocky Mountains where I could think clearly about what I wanted from future relationships without the constant stress of Elena's harassment campaign. The mountain air and physical exhaustion from daily hikes helped clear my head in ways that months of dealing with Elena's manipulation hadn't allowed, giving me perspective on how toxic our dynamic had become. During those quiet evenings in Colorado, I realized that Elena had never actually known me as a person, only as a provider who happened to have some interests she'd initially found charming but ultimately came to see as obstacles to the lifestyle she wanted. 6 months after returning from Colorado, I met someone new through a mutual friend's hiking group, a woman named Sarah who worked as a museum curator and had genuine appreciation for historical artifacts and the stories they represented. Sarah's enthusiasm for vintage items was authentic rather than performative, based on deep knowledge and personal passion rather than social media aesthetics or investment potential, and she understood immediately why someone would spend months tracking down a specific timepiece for someone they cared about. When I eventually told Sarah the story of Elena and the Omega watch, her response was everything I'd hoped Elena's would have been, expressing amazement at the watch's history and craftsmanship while being genuinely moved that someone would put so much thought and effort into finding such a meaningful gift. The contrast between Sarah's genuine appreciation and Elena's materialistic dismissal confirmed that I'd made the right choice in ending things, even though it had taken Elena months of increasingly desperate behavior to finally accept that decision.